Welcome to the America's Food and Beverage Show and Conference. Our first conference is how U.S. importers can comply with U.S. regulations. And our speaker is Lenny Feldman. Lenny Feldman is a member of Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg and resident in the Miami office. Lenny is also currently the co-chair of the 20-member U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Commercial Customs Operation Advisory Committee, providing strategic recommendations directly to U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Departments of Homeland Security and Treasury on issues such as e-commerce policy, trade programs, trade partnership programs, and enforcement, facilitation mechanisms, and regulatory reform. And Lenny is also the past chair of the World Trade Center Miami and a current board member of the World Trade Center Miami. So Lenny, thank you so much for doing this and being our first conference session for the America's Food and Beverage Show. So take it away.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here today. First, I want to make sure, since I am the first one, can you hear me okay and see me okay?
Yes.
Great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to share my screen with you so you could see the presentation. So I believe at this point you should be able to see the presentation. Let me hit the slideshow. And if I could just get a confirmation, are you able to see the presentation at this point?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so hold on one second. I am going to make sure I have the right setting on that. Okay, I see what I have to do here. How about now?
Yes.
You can see it now? Great.
Yes.
Perfect. It's always good to check things out in this virtual world we live in. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. So glad that you could be here in our virtual America's Food and Beverage Show. Every year it's such a pleasure to present, and I wish I could be with you all in person. And in time, I am confident that that will happen. But I got to tell you, whether we're in person or virtual, the cargo is continuing to flow for certain types of merchandise at numbers we've never seen before. A lot of it is e-commerce, but a lot of it continues to be the container loads that we see on vessels and that we see in the air as well. So still a lot of questions about importing into the US when it comes to food and beverage products. And I'm going to go through for some of you, whether this is, as we say, old hat and you've done it before and you need to brush up, or whether it's new to you, hopefully to take out some of the mystique on how importers can comply with US regulations. And let me make it clear, even if you're not a US importer, but you are an exporter in a foreign country wishing or currently already selling or shipping to the United States, this is what you need to know when it comes to compliance and how to get your cargo through. So with that, I'm going to launch into our presentation, and it always starts with finding the right partner. Whether you're a buyer or seller, you want to make sure if you're going to enhance compliance that you're working with somebody that you could trust. And I know it's even harder when you're in that virtual world. You can't see each other physically in a trade show, but you can still, as we're doing now, meet with each other and get some information and get to know each other as to what that history is, what that background is. And I always joke around in a way and I say, look, before you get in any relationship, before I met my wife, I would date her, I would get to know her family. Where does she hang out? What does she do? It's really no different when it comes to finding your business partner. How long have they been in business? What's their history? What type of financial stability do they have? Is there a way that you could ask them about how they've been able to make it, for example, through the pandemic? Do they work with various banks? Do they have any types of loans or ways to ensure that they will be around? What do their sales look like? What do their forecasts look like? How about their reputation? Anyone that they could tell you that they've worked with in the past or over 5, 10, 15 years that can be a trustworthy recommendation. And then you might want to start with some smaller types of product samples, if you will, or shipments, not a full container load, but a less than full container load to see how they do. Can they meet the deadlines? How do they adapt to changes? How, for example, have they looked at other markets and how have they been able to deal with other markets, especially in light of the changes in the world? Quality control, especially when it comes to food. Do they have the right expertise? Who takes care of their quality control? Have they had third-party inspections, for example? The labor standards, this is important, we'll go back to it, that you have to stay away from any kind of forced labor. That's become a really big issue over the last year or two when it comes to import compliance. If there's forced labor, the merchandise is not coming in, it's not even admissible. So I think asking them about their hiring practices and where they find their labor is really something you have to think about, along with their social compliance standpoint. And security is still critical, not only from a biological standpoint or a health standpoint, but also still from terrorist standpoint, and also to make sure that there's no contraband in the cargo as well, or no illicit goods. Customs and Border Protection has been very clear that those shipments will not be tolerated. So when we go to the different admissibility requirements and whether cargo can in fact even come in, if it's even admissible into the US, you have to consider that we have about 48 government agencies that touch import and to an extent export as well. But it's everything from the US Department of Agriculture, the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is a part of USDA, and the Agricultural Marketing Service, Centers of Disease Control. That's one we've been hearing a lot more about over the past year or so, and those requirements that always played a role as well. EPA, Environmental Protection, APHIS, the Plant and Health Safety Group, which is also in USDA. And then we have the TTB, which is the Tax and Trade Bureau for alcohol and tobacco, if you're bringing in alcoholic beverages. NOAA, which involves fisheries, and the big one on the top there, the Food and Drug Administration, which always is looking at food, anything that we consume. All of these agencies play different roles depending on the product that you would be bringing into the US. So let's start with FDA. This is not going to be an in-depth discussion of FDA because my colleague Dominic Veneziano, who used to be the director of the import operations at FDA, will be discussing it in depth. And I really encourage you to take part in that discussion. So critical to any type of food and beverage products coming in. And as you could see from the slide, the FDA regulates so many different types of merchandise under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act primarily, that affect humans, whether it's something we ingest, something we might use topically. But all foods, whether they're dietary supplements, beverages, do come under the FDA jurisdiction, except in some cases, poultry and meats, which, as we'll discuss, come under the FSIS. Well, one of the big issues that folks are dealing with or have adjusted with over the last 5 years or so is the FSMA. It's the Food Safety Modernization Act. And again, Dominic is our expert. We'll be talking about this a little more later on in the week. But I wanted you just to know and issue spotted at this point that what the FSMA requires is facility registration, that all foreign and domestic food facilities need to register. They need a registration number or your product is not coming in. So we do a lot of work through a sister company of ours, and there are others out there as well that provide that registration, and it's something that has to occur every 2 years. So a lot of companies right now as we speak, and if you're one of them, make sure that you get that food facility registration, and we can help you with that, by the way. For it's a very pretty easy, straightforward process, but it's so critical because if you don't register, which indicates that you consent to FDA looking at your records, inspecting you, and that you would be liable if you are outside of the US, that your agent would be liable for payment of any facility reinspection fees. You can't bring your food in. It's that simple. And then the FSMA goes further. It has other types of controls that some of you probably already used to if you have been involved in the food import-export business. But the FSMA made it clear that there need to be preventative controls for human food. This goes along with concepts of good manufacturing processes or GMPs, food safety plans, looking at, for example, possible hazards with people, the ingredients, the environment, preventative type controls, your process, any types of allergens, sanitation, how you handle the supply chain, how you handle recalls. Need to have that as part of your FSMA plan, your foreign producers or farms do. Produce safety, making sure that everything from water to soil to sprouts even, and animals, looking at workers, the equipment, the tools and building, all meet the appropriate safety requirements that, again, Dominic's going to be detailing later this week. And the big one that's come up more recently are the Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, or the FSVP. And we've consulted with companies on that. And there are a lot of good companies that provide training on this if needed. But basically what it's doing is it's putting the responsibility on the importer to document and declare if the firm, and the firm means the entity or the foreign company or producer, is under a comparable or equivalent food safety oversight to our standard. It has to meet the US standard, of course, at least, and that they're in compliance with Food Safety Authority through a qualified individual, somebody that's knowledgeable. And this knowledgeable individual would conduct compliance reviews, a hazard analysis, evaluate it, approve it, and verify it, and do it periodically as well. If you do not, as an importer, have this FSVP evidence or proof, you could receive a warning and again, possibly be kicked out of the import process. And the other one too that needs to be mentioned, even though this might not affect your company directly, is the Sanitary Transportation Requirement, it's FSMA. This applies to shippers, the transporters, those who receive, load, cargo carriers who transport it. And I think most companies are up to snuff on this, but I would just put it out there, if you are involved in transporting food in the US, that you make sure that your intermediary is familiar with the Sanitary Transportation Requirement. There's also other FDA requirements apart from the FSMA that you need to be very much aware of. There always has been for years the LACF and ACD canned food requirements, low acid and acidified. And basically what you need is a food canning establishment number, your FCE, and your approved scheduled process submission ID, your SID, for various types of low acid or acidified canned foods. I think of those olives, for example, that come in a can, or maybe even sealed type plastic, and making sure that they are produced properly and they meet the sanitation standards that are required. And if they do, and if you go through those steps, then you report into FDA the necessary information, you get those numbers, and then you declare those, you provide those to FDA through your customs broker at the time of entry. The other thing that you need your customs broker to do for any type of food product, even if it's a small shipment, a de minimis, less than $800 shipment, which goes through the green lane, you still need prior notice. And with prior notice, this is going to apply to any food for use, storage, or distribution in the US, transshipped through the US to another country, just if it's going through, if it's imported and it's going to eventually be exported, even if it's going to be an FTZ, necessary to have this prior notice, just alerting FDA through the system of record that your food is coming in. And there's certain time frames prior to arrival to submit that prior notice. For truck, it's 2 hours, rail is 4, air is 4, and by water, meaning a vessel, 8 hours. The other issues, definitely I would at least bullet point there, which hopefully Dominic will go into in more detail as well later this week, is compliant and sufficient labeling. We've seen a lot of products held up, food products, because they don't have the proper labeling. Dietary supplements, especially, they have their additional types of labeling that's needed. And they can't be misbranded in any way. And as I mentioned, finally, the good manufacturing practices as well, to go through the process, show that the appropriate preventative action and the almost like the HACCP or the hazard analysis and control plan step-by-step is in place to assure FDA and the government that you are meeting at least or above the US standards. At the end of the day, what you want to do is make sure you avoid getting yourself on an import alert, whether you're the importer or especially the foreign facility. And what an import alert is, it's kind of like a blacklist, really, that if there's a history of violations regarding your commodities and maybe even an area or country of origin, you could in fact be listed on this import alert. And what this means is that your product will be detained without a physical exam. You are in automatic detention, your cargo is held, and then you would have to show that you met the appropriate standards of wholeness, of being a food that is not adulterated or misbranded in any way and can go through. The only way that you would be able to be taken off of the blacklist and removed from that DWPE, as we call it, is by submitting a petition. FDA reviews it, and you're able to show that you have 5 non-violating shipments and assure FDA that the violation and the reason for the violation has been cured. If not, then you're going to really have a difficult time getting your food in. So again, there'll be more on FDA this week, but I think so critical to understand those regulations are out there initially and give you that high level review. The other one that I always like to mention is USDA. I talked about briefly the Food Safety Inspection Service. Just to note that if you have meat or poultry or egg products, there are safety standards that must be adhered to. And this even considers those where you have, say, a chicken soup or you have beef broth that's being maybe provided mixed with other types of food. If you have a percentage more than a marginal percentage or threshold, we are going to have to make sure that the beef and poultry meets the standards, the equivalency standards here in the US as well. APHIS also is going to restrict some products from entering the US due to animal disease conditions, due to health requirements. And that's where you hear about the mad cow disease, for example, or the Newcastle disease. So you have to be aware of which countries are prohibited, which are permissible, and which have that equivalency, so there shouldn't be a problem. But I've seen folks go into business in the meat and poultry piece and not know that they are considering bringing it in from a country which is prohibited. Complying with the APHIS requirements, they're involved with, of course, animals, as I mentioned, regulating the health of not only animals, but animal products, plants, monitoring the movement of risk material, again, to make sure pests do not come in. They have treatments for fruit and origin that are very specific. So if you are involved with particular, let's say, avocados, blueberries, there are certain restrictions based on where you're bringing them into the US and what countries they're coming from. There's very particular guidelines as to what is the treatment that's needed, whether it's a methyl bromide treatment or it's some other type of cold treatment that you're looking at to bring the product in. And we've been very active in South Florida in trying to open up the community to some of these perishables that were not permissible from the Americas or from Africa and had to go to colder water or weather ports up to Philadelphia and then be trucked down. So if you are thinking about the perishables or something that is primarily a perishable incorporates it, you need to look and see if it is permissible and if it's treated properly. And of course, making sure that you could clear the inspection that would be necessary when it comes in. For our friends out there who are involved with liquor, just wanted to put it out there that you have to be aware of the TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. Not only is there a federal permit that's needed if you're going to be involved in the wholesale or the import or export of it, or if you're transiting it outside of a bonded warehouse, you definitely need a TTB license. If you're going to just transit it and keep it in a bonded facility, you may have some flexibility, but still TTB does watch and see what's coming in and out of the warehouses if sales are being consummated in the US. And depending on the state you're in, you're going to have different types of liquor laws and requirements and permits that are needed. Some the states control it, others you get a license, but you need still to have a 3-tier system in place between an importer, a wholesaler distributor, and a retailer. Believe it or not, it's still quite regulated in that way due to racketeering over the years. Not necessarily a big issue now, but that's still left over from the days where this was an area for a lot of criminal activity, believe it or not. The other agency, so to speak, you need to be careful about and aware of is the Patent and Trademark Office and CBP's enforcement of trademarks and copyrights in particular. There is necessary registration with the Patent and Trademark Office for any type of trademark and with the Copyright Office as well for copyrights. And then a lot of companies take the second step to record their product with customs. And I've seen, believe it or not, quite a bit of fake products coming through the US in and out of South Florida, either counterfeit, which are completely fake or false, or ones that would be considered more confusingly similar, that it's not such a clear knockoff, but it's confusing to the consumer. And that's why if you're going into business, and you see with this visual here, it's the Oreo, the Oris, probably going to be a problem there, not a counterfeit, but confusingly similar, which should be a red flag. But we see this all the time. And it's very important for you as an importer to ask your seller, do they have authorization? Do they have a license agreement? What can they show you that proves that it is okay? Now, gray market, where you have product that's kind of being imported and exported in and out of the region and in and out of the Western Hemisphere, not necessarily something that the government is going to prohibit from entering because it's genuine product that just maybe has been changing hands to a party who doesn't have the distribution rights, but that won't stop the trademark owner from trying to enforce that, send you a cease and desist letter. So take this seriously. This is a top priority for the current administration and therefore for Customs and Border Protection, even if it's a small size package. The other hot issue is forced labor, making sure that there is absolutely no forced or indentured labor, and this includes forced child labor, wholly or in part in the products you are bringing over. And again, it might just be a material, it could be an ingredient that the government knows to track back to a forced labor factory or even a region in certain respects, making it prohibitive to bring in. And if in fact there's forced labor, then the merchandise is subject to being excluded from entry into the US. It might be seized if it is clear that there is forced labor. There could even be penalties and criminal investigation. That's how critical this is. If the information that is provided regarding forced labor it's reasonably, but it's not clear that the merchandise is subject to forced labor, customs issues withhold release orders. If there's a WRO on the customs website, it means not necessarily the product will never be able to come in, but it's going to be detained, and customs is going to want information to show that it was not produced with forced labor. They're going to want payment records. They're going to want to know about the company and how it manages its business. Do they recruit folks to work and basically bring people in and say, hey, you're going to have to pay me X amount of dollars to work at my company, and gradually after a certain amount of time it'll be considered to no longer be a debt. That is problematic, although it might not be forced labor per se. So a real critical issue to consider. Some examples, we've seen these withhold release orders, kind of like a detention order for alleged forced labor for China products. We've seen it from several manufacturers or providers of tea, of grapes, of peeled garlic, of soda ash, of stevia more recently, and some vessels which have been providing and exporting seafood to the US. So be aware of that. Now, while cocoa is not particularly on a withhold release order for forced labor, there have been very robust investigations regarding cocoa. And a lot of the cocoa or chocolate importers have been brought in to Customs and Border Protection at headquarters and asked very pointed questions as to how they manage forced labor, ensuring that it's not something that they would find in any of their supply chains, especially in the Ivory Coast and in Africa. So again, please be aware of this breaking issue. It's continuing to grow. Also from the CBP standpoint, consider what country you're going to be sourcing from, because that could really make or break your duty situation. I'd like to start with a brief explanation of the trade programs. We have some really good opportunities throughout the Americas. The Caribbean Basin is still alive and well. The Caribbean Basin Initiative has been around, as we know, for years, since the 70s. Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership just renewed. DRCAFTA, the Central American countries through El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and of course, Dominican Republic. Great opportunities there, and that provides some really good ways to bring food product in from those countries as well. Now, typically we don't see the food have a high rate of duty, but there could be safeguards because it is a product that might be sensitive to U.S. industries and harm industries here in the U.S. and growers, but there are allotted limits, if you will, under DRCAFTA. Same with the USMCA. As you know, we just went through a very robust agreement and some negotiations there that allow for dairy, for example, from Canada to come in. So I would look at the region there as well and see if those equivalencies should be in place too to help with the admissibility issues we discussed. Chile, you probably think of wine and grapes, a lot of good opportunities there. Seafood, we see a lot coming into South Florida, good opportunities there. Peru and Colombia and Panama. And the Mideast as well, we see quite a bit from Israel and the Quiz regions and the other parts of the area, Jordan and Bahrain, and Africa. And in Asia, we see Singapore and Australia. Now, the final one, the generalized system of preferences, that has most food products under duty-free status, depending on the country. For example, Thailand, issues of some products not being renewed because it's not a formal or continued program, and it is going to expire at the end of the year. So we have to keep our eye on that ball if you're going from the 120 plus countries under the generalized system of preferences, because that might change around by the end of the year if it doesn't get removed. And, you know, we're in some interesting political times right now, so I have to see where that goes. So good opportunities to lower or just completely take away any types of tariffs if you're going in from these countries with free trade agreements or preference programs. Also, make sure that you study them carefully, understand how to originate, because the rules for these agreements are not alike. Unfortunately, when you negotiate with one country or a group of countries, one after the other, you're going to develop different rules. If it's grown from the start, you're in that country, you're going to be fine. But if you're talking about processed foods where you might bring in certain ingredients and then you do some light processing, it might not qualify as a product of that country, and then you don't get the benefit of that trade agreement. However, if you really transform the product based on the value and the change in the article and its use and character, you probably will be okay and qualify. So you have to look at each product and really what's being done in that country or region compared to what might have been the situation with the inputs coming in. And then, of course, having the supporting documents. Again, the rules are different, whether it's a certificate of origin, a bill of lading showing that it's a direct shipment, really making sure you have that information so that you qualify at the end of the day. Now, a lot of this really is based on the harmonized tariff system, the classification system, and it is a stack of documents. Luckily, over the last few years, people have just been using the automated version of it. And you have to make sure you understand when you have a product, what is it classified? What is the provision that's used? Because one provision compared to another can really have a completely different duty rate and is something you need to factor in your sourcing. Now, sometimes companies will manipulate the product a little bit, and they might make a mixture of some type of product so that they use a more favorable rate. That is legal if you are clear and you're transparent about what you're doing, because a product is always classified based on its condition as imported when it's coming in, not necessarily what was the product before, let's say, it was finalized or it was produced abroad. So companies look at that. They look at what is advantageous to them when it comes to that final type of product and how it is produced. And you have to make sure to avoid anti-dumping. There are some food products, and I'll show you an example in a minute, where some of the food products are being dumped into the US at less than fair market values, some of them from Asia. And as a result, you could pay 100 or 200% tariff on it because of the trade adjustment that's needed based on the proceedings that have occurred here in the US. And finally, you've probably heard about the trade remedies, the China tariffs, and that uplifts your product from anywhere from 10, 15 to 25%. And it looks like those are going to remain for quite some time, regardless of what administration is elected or comes into power. So there is an exclusion as an example for tilapia, right? So tilapia was hit as a product coming in from Asia, which had a higher and elevated rate of duty, a 25% rate of duty. And it was for tilapia weighing not more than 4 ounces. So an exclusion was requested from the tariff. If the tilapia was under 4 ounces and classified in the proper tariff provision, you would, as I like to say, escape the high China tariff. Well, it ended up the way the tilapia industry works, if any of you know about it, they usually bring in bundles, if you will, of the tilapia up to 5 ounces, like 3 to 5 ounces. So you can imagine a lot of importers went toe to toe with customs as to whether they could show from a sampling a proportion, the majority of the tilapia met the 4 ounce or lower rule and therefore was excluded from the high China tariffs, or if it was too difficult for them to prove it beyond a fair amount of evidence and proof, so that everything still had to pay the higher rate. So this is an issue that I'm working with a lot of importers on right now, but it shows you based on the tariff description and just based on the weight or the characteristics of the product, there's a lot of different factors that could really impact you when it comes to bringing in foreign food. So why is classification so important? Well, here's an example that our firm was successful with, and it involves frozen tuna fillets. And all of us love tuna, right? But especially we love tuna if we're able to bring it in duty-free as opposed to bringing it in with a higher rate. So this was skinless, boneless, frozen tuna, and it was treated with tasteless smoke. It was described, if you will, as loin, steaks, strips, poke cubes, and it was super pure. There was a super purified smoke that was introduced to the flesh to ensure that there was not a change in color, right? We all love that nice red, juicy tuna, right? Well, this is why it looks that way, because there was a tasteless smoke that was used so that it wouldn't change color and start to look unappealing to us. So the big question was, well, this type of tuna with this tasteless smoke, is it a fish fillet in heading 0304 of the tariff? Is it smoked fish in 0305? Or is it in 1604 prepared or preserved fish? And I'll tell you that if you're in a prepared or preserved category because you've done more, you've made the product more than a fish, you're going to have a higher duty rate. So you know what our client wanted us to do? They wanted us to go into the fish fillet provision. So it ended up that we argued that the tasteless smoke did not dry the instant tuna products. It just created a chemical reaction. It did not create a preserved tuna because it doesn't change the condition as any type of permanent preservation. And it did not create a prepared tuna because it didn't alter the taste of it. It's not as though we added, say, sesame seeds and soy and made this whole fancy product out of it. So at the end of the day, Customs agreed that it remained in 0304 as fish fillets at a free rate of duty. So that's an example of why classification of certain products are so critical. And I'll tell you, in the food industry, which I've been working with for years, that whenever you bring in combinations of products, whether it's fruits or vegetables, kind of like a stir fry, yes, those vegetables or those different types of fruits, if you do a fruit salad or fruit mix, they have different tariff and duty rates. So you really have to look, what is the essential part of it, or is there not? And sometimes you just might classify it based on the product that falls last in the tariff. So you really got to think about these things. I also told you about anti-dumping duties, and that is a killer if you're going to be faced with these anti-dumping or countervailing duties and kind of a trade remedy, a trade war. Well, there was a big one for years that came across the crawfish tail meat that was coming in from Asia, and it covered freshwater crawfish tail meat in all forms and grades and sizes, whether it was frozen, fresh, or chilled, and regardless how it was packed. So pretty broad on any kind of freshwater crawfish tail meat. The product that was being looked at and considered, and this went up to the Court of Appeals Federal Circuit, that's what the CAFC means at the top, was a crawfish etouffee. If you've been in New Orleans or even in South Florida, I love etouffee. And what do? It involves a lot of different ingredients, right? It has flour, it has cooking oil, onions and peppers and tomatoes and vegetables. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. And the seasonings and thickeners in there. So there's cooking, it integrates and blends the ingredients together. You know what I'm talking about if you've enjoyed your New Orleans crawfish etouffee. So the question was that product within the scope of the ADD, the anti-dumping order, or not? So it's, again, you're looking at the processing and preparation. So here we're going the opposite direction, right? We want to get away from just it being a crawfish. We want it to be more than crawfish. We want it out of this specific description for this dumping order. And it doesn't matter, by the way, for anti-dumping, as to the classification provision. It really comes down more to the scope. It's another agency we're looking at, Department of Commerce. Is it in that criteria or not? Well, Commerce considered additional criteria when it comes to origin and product, and found that the tail meat had undergone a substantial transformation. That's the magic legal term sometimes, so that it no longer was considered freshwater crawfish tail meat. It was considered a stew with many ingredients. In addition to the tail meat, it was a final product ready to be served. So we saved, at the end of the day, the crawfish etouffee was spared the disaster of the anti-dumping duties because it was not within the scope. That's what it's about, folks. These are the things you need to look at. Your condition is imported in the product, which could just completely, not only for compliance purposes, but for business purposes, have such an impact. So let's look at a few other issues before we turn it over for some questions. The valuation of your product. You can't undervalue it. You have to get that commercial invoice, show and really express to customs what you were paying for the product. I know some of you deal in consignment, then you come up with a reasonable estimate. And after the consigned goods are imported and sold, if you true that up and you pay additional money to your foreign supplier seller, you got to report that in. So you're really looking at the total payment. If you're loaning the money for, I've seen this for seeds or for fertilizer, or providing it free of charge, that all adds to the value of the product. You have to add those values, that worth of the product you're creating, to that declared value. So at the end of the day, we sometimes see commercial invoices which are a lot less than the true value of the product because other monies or other things were provided to the grower that weren't added into that value. So be very careful with that, especially if you're dealing with a related party. If any of you have a buyer-seller relationship, a family relationship, or two companies that are related somehow with common owners or under the same parent company, customs looks to that. They make you report in through your customs broker whether you're related, and they know that that usually is an indicator of a undervalued product, a low value. So you need to consider that and how to maybe use another method of valuation if the price itself doesn't work. We've saved companies lots of money, especially on these China tariffs, by using first sale also. That's a very exciting method and way to help your bottom line. If you have, say, a Chinese producer of food, they maybe sell it to a trading company who sells it on to you. If we could get that first sale price, which some companies are willing to provide, we could use that first sale price as opposed to the second and higher price by law, because that's still a sale of export to the United States, that lower as opposed to higher price. So something to think about. The other thing also, which we see a lot of companies do in South Florida, are using bonded warehouse and foreign trade zones in order to avoid any duty payment whatsoever. We often see products come in from Europe and Asia to be shipped out to the Americas or vice versa. Well, a bonded warehouse gives you 5 years on storing the product in a local bonded facility under customs control. You are not going to be able to really manufacture or change the product or change the duty rate there. You can do some manipulation, some repackaging if you get permission from customs, but others use foreign trade zones. And there's not even a 5-year rule. You're able to actually declare what's coming in at a certain duty rate, classify it when it comes in. And if you make a new product that might have a higher duty rate going out, you could still fix that lower duty rate and use that, although the product coming out has a higher one. So I think you might want to look at that if you are looking at potentially doing some production or food manufacture, say in the US, but you don't want to have to pay the tariffs while they're in the country. Very good opportunities, which a lot of companies consider, especially if they need that storage time. We have cold storage in South Florida if you don't have that buyer or seller yet. Also, some companies use container freight stations. You are able to kind of recontainerize, consolidate, if that helps your business model too. And what if you ended up paying the duties and then you say, wow, now I'm exporting it. Why did I pay those duties only to export it out? And I could have used a bonded facility. Well, it's not too late. What you are able to do is have 99% of your duties and fees refunded if in fact you're able to show that you paid duties on the same product going out, or ahead of time you're able to ask for a drawback contractor agreement where you show you have a substituted merchandise or similar merchandise that's coming in that was going out. This is to encourage exports and award those companies who are importing and then exporting same or similar merchandise or substitution merchandise, or using it to manufacture merchandise that is exported. Import to export, 99% refund on your duties if you could show that link to the product. So as the exporter, they're going to be the party who would get the duties. So as the importer, if you are the exporter, you're able to create that link between the two of you so that you're able to show the duties were paid, get the duties refunded, or create an agreement between you and an exporter who you might know of product and get 99% back. It's a great duty refund opportunity. And as you're doing this again, you've been hearing me discuss the invoice, and it's so important, that commercial invoice, making sure it's accurate with all the information we discussed, that country of origin, the value for the goods, any types of rebates that you might get, having a very good, clear, detailed description of the merchandise. Because as you know, whether it is a prepared food or a fresh food or a mixed food, that description is going to go to your customs broker and to Customs and Border Protection to make sure you comply with those requirements and classify it in the right provision. It gets that specific. Your quantities, your weights, everything needs to be perfect if you're going to comply, and it all comes down to the invoice. And folks, an invoice is not optional. These data elements are not optional. These are required by law, that the regulations actually specify what an invoice must include, what it must say. So please make sure that you're really focused on that and aware of the information on your invoice as a declaration, a legal declaration to customs. If it's wrong, then they could frankly collect penalties or additional duties from you. And making sure you work with the customs broker here in the US who files the documents accurately and timely. It's called a 7501. It sets forth all of this information from the invoice in a data feed that goes to the government. Make sure you are the rightful owner of the product, please, who's bringing it in, not just a logistics company who's going to file it for you. They really don't have the standing or the right to bring it in. The invoice is part of that document set, of course, a packing list, which should be consistent with that, and anything else that would be used to determine admissibility, like if there's another government agency, like I said, the FDA, TTB, and you have that information as well. And this is what an entry looks like. As you can see, a lot of information. Your customs broker knows how to file it through the automated broker interface to make sure it is 100% accurate. And you'll see, I know it's a little blurry, not only does it have an area for the harmonized tariff rate and the product description, but also any anti-dumping, any countervailing duty, any Section 3 China tariffs that are required. They all have to be reported here on the full value, not the partial value. Finally, I also want to encourage you, as I started with, working with good partners, work with secure partners, work with those who are familiar with the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism or CTPAT program, about 11,000 companies there. AEO partners, the Authorized Economic Operator, which is the security program equivalent from the US program throughout the Americas and the EU, as well as a lot of Asia countries. It's a voluntary program. You as an importer could do it, as a customs broker can and should do it, as an intermediary. That kind of shows that extra standard of care and awareness of the supply chain, that you've met that security criteria. You're ensuring that you're taking the steps that the container is clean so that pests now cannot come into it. So it's a really good way to vet your partners and make sure they are on board with these additional criteria. And what it means is reduced inspections, sometimes 3 to 8 times less inspections, especially as they relate to security for your cargo as it comes in. So with that, that is the long and short of it. And I know it's a lot in a short amount of time on the import compliance requirements from the other government agencies and really from Customs and Border Protection when it comes to your food and agricultural products. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it back over to Ivan and or Yendi for next steps.
Hey, Lenny, that was great. Right now, we don't have any Q&As. Are there any questions out there that our audience would like to put in the Q&A box? Well, Lenny, thank you so much for such a great presentation and for participating in the America's Food and Beverage Show. We want to thank Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg for their sponsorship. Such great partners in our community. You can watch a recording of this later on after the show. We'll have recordings of all the sessions available.
Well, great. It was my pleasure. And if anybody has any questions, you'll have my information, my phone number, and my email. Encourage you all to take the right steps, work with a good customs broker, a good team that can ensure that you are complying. And I think then you'll see your cargo go through and quite a speedy way, actually, without delays. So I wish all of you good luck and encourage you to continue to import and export and just be compliant when you do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenny. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.